Hello, my friends. In the last few days, a so-called 28-point peace plan from the United States has been widely discussed in Western media as a potential roadmap to end the war in Ukraine. According to leaks, the document was drafted in Miami in talks involving American political figures and the Russian businessman Kirill Dmitriev, and then reportedly shown to the Ukrainian side. But in Moscow, the reaction has been very clear. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has stated that Russia has not officially received any plan from Washington and therefore has nothing formal to discuss. In other words, from the Russian point of view, this is not an agreed document between states, but rather a private initiative being sold to the media as something bigger than it really is. At the same time, Russian officials and analysts are stressing one central point: the goals of the special military operation have not changed. Moscow says it will continue to pursue the demilitarization of Ukraine and the neutralization of what it calls the NATO threat on its borders, and it is not interested in any proposal that simply freezes the current front line and allows the West to regroup. On the Western side, we are seeing growing confusion and frustration. European leaders are publicly angry about being left out of back-channel talks, worried about new corruption scandals in Kiev, and increasingly nervous about the political cost of financing a long war with no clear end state. At the same time, they continue to speak of Russian aggression while avoiding any serious debate about how tens of billions in aid to Ukraine have actually been used. While the West struggles to define a coherent strategy, a new center of gravity is consolidating elsewhere. This week in Moscow, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, met at high level. For the first time, President Vladimir Putin publicly described the SCO as a power bloc, a political and economic pillar bringing together key Eurasian states such as Russia, China, India, Iran, and others. In parallel, the expanded BRICS group and its partners are working on mechanisms for trade, finance, and energy cooperation that bypass traditional Western structures like SWIFT and the dollar system. Put simply, while Washington and Brussels argue over plans on paper, Eurasia is quietly building a different reality on the ground. New trade routes, new energy flows, new financial tools, and new political formats that no longer depend on Western approval. In Ukraine itself, there is a growing sense, even among Western insiders, that the Zelensky government will eventually be replaced, not by a popular vote, but by a managed transition once Washington decides it needs a new face in Kyiv. What remains entirely unclear is who could take over and how much of the Ukrainian state will still be intact when that moment comes. So we are looking at two overlapping crises: a military crisis where Russia shows no sign of backing down and NATO has no credible conventional path to victory, and a strategic crisis where the old Western-led order is being challenged by rising Eurasian institutions like SCO and BRICS. For now, Moscow's message is straightforward. Russia will not accept cosmetic deals, will not legitimize what it sees as a Nazi-influenced regime in Kyiv, and will continue its operation until its declared objectives are achieved. How the United States and Europe respond to that reality, and whether they can adapt to a world they no longer fully control, will define not only the future of Ukraine, but the shape of the international system for decades to come. In the last 2 months, we've had an acceleration of territory gained by the Russians. According to Julian Repka, it could be, by the end of this month, depending on how things go, close to 900 to possibly 1,000 square kilometers this month alone, which would set an all-time record. I agree that speed matters, but I always remind people, you define success when you compare the result to the stated objectives. And what was the stated objective? It was demilitarization. Demilitarization refers to potential, not to territory. That is very much Clausewitzian, and the book on the Russian art of war is explicit on that. The Russian military doctrine is based on the destruction of a potential. As Clausewitz said, we have to destroy the potential, the military potential. It's not territory. That is the key aspect. Therefore, if you compare now the 1% of territory that has been gained, and probably, as I've already noted, we have an acceleration so far, that is still not the main point. The main point is that the Russians have managed to destroy, in fact, they have destroyed twice or probably 3 times the initial Ukrainian army. Of course, since nobody talks openly about Ukrainian casualties or fatalities, nobody can verify this precisely, myself included. I am basing this on figures provided by various war watchers, and they may be wrong. But again, the point is to highlight the difference between this 1% of territory that is used in the Western narrative and the number of casualties and fatalities. When I talk about 600 people per day, I'm talking about fatalities for Ukraine, not just casualties, fatalities, not wounded. And then on top of that, you have desertions, which by this year alone are reported at around 161,000, according to Ukrainian sources. Now we're getting to the point where you're getting both massive losses and massive desertions. If you destroy the capacity, you're going to get the territory in one big blow. You don't have to take it piece by piece. The Russians are doing it in the air. They're doing it with the infrastructure, and they're doing it with the personnel, and even with the economy for that matter. So it's really across the board, and it's really starting to have an effect. That brings us back to this potential for some kind of peace plan. There are people who recognize everything I just said, and they're looking at the situation on the ground and thinking, this cannot end well. And no matter what Kajakala says or what Zelensky himself might want, at some point they simply won't be able to continue because the numbers are what they are. Now, I wish I could just keep the bony finger pointed at the Europeans and at the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, there are also people right here in Washington, D.C., even on Fox News, who seem to be pushing the same bad narrative. You'll have to excuse me for not being optimistic at all. I base that on the decades I spent at the CIA trying to see the world through what was described as the twisted KGB eyes of Vladimir Putin. And if the past is prologue, the argument goes that Putin is trying to use negotiations to curry favor with the United States and make it appear falsely that Russia is interested in a diplomatic solution to this war, when in fact Russia continues to rain down hell on Ukraine. Just last night, a massive drone and missile barrage in a residential area in Ukraine. The timing is important. We've got sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil being implemented in about 3 days, and then the Senate has their secondary sanctions bill warmed up and ready. The president says he is going to sign it. So that may also be something that Vladimir Putin is thinking about when he is accused of trying to run this so-called KGB false operation, disinformation operation against us, to make us think he might be interested in negotiations. But I have to point something out. What we're talking about here is an American peace plan. It's not a Russian false flag. It was formed by Secretary of State Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So calling this Russian misinformation simply doesn't match the facts. The deeper problem is that the Europeans themselves do not want to negotiate with Russia. That's the first fundamental point. They don't want it. The Russian position, by contrast, is very clear. As I've said before, Putin defined 2 conditions in June of last year. And these are conditions to start the process of negotiating, not to end it. The Russians are not against negotiation, but they have set conditions to start the process. Those 2 conditions are the withdrawal from the 4 oblasts Russia now claims as part of the Russian Federation, and the abandonment of NATO membership by Ukraine. Since the Europeans make every effort to prevent Zelensky from complying with those 2 conditions, we have no negotiation. Putin can afford this because he's winning on the battlefield. So his attitude is essentially, I set the conditions, you know them, I'm winning on the battlefield. If you don't comply with my conditions, I continue to move ahead. And the longer you wait, the smaller Ukraine will become. And that's exactly the situation we are in. Remember when we had the first attempt from the Trump administration to have this contact in Istanbul in February, March 2025? The Europeans made every effort to tell Zelensky that he should not enter any negotiation with Russia, that any negotiation between the US and Russia would not be accepted by Europe, and therefore there would be no process. Basically, they were against any process. We are back to what I said before. The European Union has made virtually no effort whatsoever to engage in any kind of political solution for the conflict. That's the reason why the Trump administration doesn't even consider having the Europeans around the table, because they are not a serious party to the negotiations. They have provided weapons to Ukraine, but in terms of negotiation and diplomacy, they are not a real actor in the peace process. To illustrate the Russian view of this so-called peace plan, let me share what I learned on the ground. I'm Larry C. Johnson, a former CIA officer, and I'm currently in Moscow on a prearranged trip. When all this started breaking, I asked what was going on in Russia, what they are saying. I spoke to Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia, and asked her directly about this 28-point plan. She told me, we haven't seen anything in writing. We are at least willing to look at it. We're going to consider it, but our core issues and core requirements remain the same. And I also spoke to General Alaudanov this morning, the man responsible for driving the Ukrainians out of the Kursk area earlier this year. And he said very clearly, listen, it's a non-starter to ask us to give away Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. We're going to take it all. From the Russian perspective, if giving up that part of the territory is part of the deal, it is a non-starter. They are somewhat encouraged that at least some of their core issues are being addressed in draft discussions, but they insist that unless it's all of it, they will simply keep driving militarily until they take it all. There's a nuance here. My understanding of the plan, and we must be honest, we do not have the full document, only fragments, is that it is not about giving back Zaporizhzhia and Kherson to Ukraine. It is about setting the limit on the battle line, the front line, as the de facto border. So instead of having those two oblasts divided according to their full political borders, the idea is to use the current front line as the border. In essence, it's a compromise between what Putin asked for and what has been called the Kellogg Plan, which was basically to draw the delineation on the front line. For Donbass, the political borders would be considered for the two southern oblasts. The front line would serve as the boundary. Again, I don't know whether all Russian officers I spoke to have seen the same details. I'm not sure I know every clause either. The information I have comes from Russian sources, so I assume it is broadly correct, but some doubts remain. Still, it would make sense as a compromise between the two positions. From the Russian point of view, one can also ask, why should they compromise on anything if, as they say, the 14th of June 2024 lines include all of the administrative borders of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson? Why should they compromise when they have the power to continue and try to compel it on the battlefield? It's hard to argue against that logic from a strictly military perspective. However, there is another factor. Inside Russia itself, people are starting to be tired of the conflict. If you look at polls from the Levada Center, you see a kind of fatigue in the population, and that might be an aspect considered by Putin. Again, I don't know his inner thinking, but we must acknowledge that, yes, Russia is winning, and there is no strong military incentive to make concessions. On the other hand, the idea that fighting would continue indefinitely without any prospect of ending might also push Russia to say, of course we're winning, but we don't want to fight forever. If we can find a compromise that helps Ukraine make a decision to stop fighting, we are ready to explore it. There is yet another dimension, denazification. One thing not clearly included in the reported 28-point plan is something the Russians had listed back in May, June 2024 as a core requirement, the denazification of the Ukrainian side. The question is whether Russia could compromise on not including denazification in any post-settlement arrangement. We must understand what denazification means in the Russian context. Essentially, what Vladimir Putin meant in February 2022 was the destruction of the paramilitary forces considered neo-Nazi by Russia. These were paramilitary formations used by the Kiev government to repress demonstrations and to punish people protesting for their rights, especially the language issue. Since the regular army was not ready or willing to carry out that repression, the Kiev government established ultranationalist units, call them what you will, to fight the so-called separatists, and they did so extremely brutally. These units were largely recruited from the western part of Ukraine. They are extremely nationalist. If you look at a map of Ukraine, you have the Russian-speaking population in the east and south, the Ukrainian-speaking majority in the center and west. But the center, south, and east are predominantly Orthodox. In the far west, where many of these ultranationalists come from, you have Catholic populations historically linked to the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. They feel Ukrainian, but they tend to despise the Slavs from the east. That's the social substrate from which formations such as Azov, Right Sector, and others were drawn. These paramilitaries were the ones who carried out much of the violence, torture, and brutality from 2014 to 2022. So denazification refers to the destruction of those units. Formally, one could say that when negotiations were underway in Istanbul in March 2022, the Russian High Command declared that the objective of denazification had been reached. That was probably meant to facilitate dialogue at that time, not because the problem had been completely solved, but because the Azov Brigade was then surrounded in Mariupol. This was considered a major success in the framework of denazification. For that reason, on the 28th of March 2022, the High Command said they had reached the objective of denazification, something reported by the Financial Times back then. Since then, of course, the issue has reemerged. Azov has expanded. What used to be a brigade is now 2 Army Corps. The concept of denazification is therefore still alive. For the Russians, these nationalist formations are used the same way Waffen SS units were used by the Germans in World War II, as a kind of fire brigade. If something burns on the front, they send these fanatics who will fight to the last drop of blood. They are the last resort in critical sectors. All this means that denazification, in the Russian sense, remains a sticking point. I am sure that for Russia, it will remain an issue in any final settlement. And that is one of the reasons why I think we are unlikely to see this peace plan fully implemented, and why Russia will probably continue militarily until they take what they want on the battlefield.